You've been in relationships with some from famous women. You've dated some of the biggest superstars of all time. Anything you can share with us about Cher?
Weren't you dating Cher before that? And did you
Yeah.
cheat on Cher with
course.
Diana Ross?
Of course.
Yes.
Gene Simmons spent 2 years living with one of the most famous women on the planet, called her his first love, racked up thousands of dollars in international phone bills just to hear her voice, and then left her for her best friend. The woman he left was Cher. The friend he left her for was Diana Ross. And the reason the whole thing unraveled? A Christmas present that Cher herself sent him to buy. For more than 4 decades, the public got pieces of this story. A quote here, a magazine profile there. But it wasn't until Cher published her memoir in 2024, and Gene kept giving interviews, that the full picture finally came together. And it is stranger than anyone imagined. Before we get into what happened between Gene Simmons and Cher, there's something worth understanding about who Gene Simmons actually was when they met, because the version of him that existed in 1977 was almost completely invisible to the public. Kiss was already one of the biggest rock bands in the world by the mid-70s, but no one outside their inner circle knew what any of the members actually looked like. The band performed in full-face paint at all times and had never appeared publicly without it. Gene's stage persona, a character he called the Demon, involved black and white makeup, platform boots, and a tongue that became one of the most recognizable images in rock history. Off stage, without any of that, he could walk down a street in Los Angeles and nobody would know who he was. That anonymity shaped everything about how he operated in his private life. And it created an unusual dynamic when he began moving in the circles where he met Cher, because he was simultaneously one of the most visible performers in America and a man whose actual face was almost entirely unknown. When he and Cher went out together in Los Angeles in the early days of their relationship, he was able to blend into a crowd in a way that almost no other rock star of his profile could manage. Cher wrote in her 2024 memoir that this was deliberate. Gene had a clear distinction in his mind between the demon and the private person, and he was intensely protective of that line. This matters because it tells you something about the version of Gene Simmons that Cher fell for. It wasn't the theatrical spectacle of Kiss. It was a man who was, by his own account, intellectually driven, deeply ambitious, and surprisingly domesticated in his private habits. He read constantly. He was careful with money. He adored Cher's children and was reportedly warm and engaged with them in a way that genuinely surprised people who expected the rock star behavior. This was the person behind the paint. And this is the person Cher called, in a 1979 People magazine interview, the best relationship she had ever had with a human being. That description is worth sitting with. Cher had been married twice by that point, to Sonny Bono and then to Greg Allman. She was not someone who handed out that kind of assessment lightly. And yet there it was, in print, in one of the biggest entertainment publications in the country. So the question becomes, if this was genuinely the best relationship either of them had experienced, how did it end? And why did Gene Simmons, who had everything he claimed to have always wanted, walk away from it? How they actually met, and why it almost didn't happen. The story of how Gene Simmons and Cher ended up together is one of those origin stories that sounds made up but is entirely documented. It starts in 1977 at a reception held in honor of President Gerald Ford, hosted by Neil Bogart, the head of Cher's record label at the time. Both Gene and Cher attended. When they were introduced, Cher reportedly mistook him for the British actress Gene Simmons, which is the kind of awkward opening line that should have killed any romantic potential on the spot. It didn't. Gene drove her home that night. He came back the next day with Kiss merchandise for her son Chaz, who was 9 years old at the time and a devoted fan of the band. That gesture landed. But then Gene complicated things almost immediately. At their first proper date, a concert by the band The Tubes, he spent part of the evening flirting with both Cher and the friend she had brought along. Gene called the next day to apologize. Cher, at that point, was not particularly interested in pursuing anything further. What changed the equation was what happened when Gene flew to Japan for a Kiss tour shortly after. He called her, repeatedly, from Japan, where international phone calls in the late 1970s cost a significant amount of money per minute. Gene ran up a phone bill of $2,800, staying in contact with a woman who, by her own account, hadn't fully decided she wanted to be with him yet. That's the detail that shifted things. On one of those calls, he told her he loved her. Cher wrote in her memoir that it caught her completely off guard. By 1978, they were together properly. They appeared publicly on The Mike Douglas Show. They moved in together, sharing homes in Los Angeles and Malibu. The October 1979 issue of People magazine ran them on the cover with a headline about their life together and their thoughts on marriage. In that article, Gene described Cher as his first love. He praised her children. He said he had never had a steady girlfriend before her, never shared a living space with anyone. For a man whose stage persona was built around excess and chaos, his private relationship with Cher was, by all accounts, genuinely stable and genuinely meaningful. And yet, at almost exactly the moment that magazine hit newsstands, the events that would end everything were already in motion. The Christmas errand that destroyed a relationship. Here is the part of the story that has been told and retold so many times that it almost sounds like a parable, except it actually happened. And Gene himself has described it in detail across multiple interviews and in his own 2002 memoir. It was late 1979. Christmas was approaching. Gene was preparing to return to New York for Kiss rehearsals ahead of another tour, and he was trying to figure out what to buy Cher as a gift. As he has told it many times, the challenge was obvious. What do you buy for someone who has everything? He asked Cher directly, and she had a practical answer. Her best friend Diana Ross was in New York. Cher told Gene to call Diana, explain who he was, tell her Cher had sent him, and let Diana take him shopping. Diana would know what Cher liked. Gene did exactly that. He called Diana Ross, mentioned Cher's name, and was invited over to her home. What happened next he documented in his memoir with a level of detail that made clear the moment had stayed with him. He walked in and noticed two things immediately: that Diana Ross was deeply sensual, and that she was entirely in control of her own world. She made him coffee. She offered him chocolate cake. He ate it so quickly she offered him a second slice, and that disappeared just as fast. They talked. They became friends. They started playing racquetball together. And then, gradually, and without either of them apparently planning for it, something else started happening. Gene has said in interviews that there was no hidden agenda when he first went to Diana's apartment. He was on a gift errand, nothing more. But the friendship that formed over the weeks that followed developed into something that crossed a line, and Gene knew it and didn't stop it. By the summer of 1980, a People magazine profile on Kiss reported that Gene Simmons was living with Diana Ross and her daughters. Cher, in an excruciating detail, was described as having attended a Kiss rehearsal around the same time, alongside Diana Ross. For a brief period, by some accounts, all three appeared to be navigating the situation with a level of public civility that concealed an enormous amount of private damage. The friendship between Cher and Diana Ross did not survive it. Whatever graciousness existed on the surface during those months, the relationship between the two women ended permanently. Gene managed to remain on speaking terms with both of them separately, which says something about his ability to compartmentalize, if nothing else. Why marriage was never really on the table. The question the topic raises, why Gene never married Cher, is slightly more complicated than it first appears, because for much of their time together, neither of them was particularly pushing for marriage. Cher had been through two marriages that had both ended badly. By 1979, she had publicly stated that she had what she described as a very liberated attitude to relationships. She acknowledged that Gene occasionally spent time with other women while on tour, and that she had her own occasional companionship outside the relationship. This was not a secret arrangement. She discussed it openly with the press. Gene's position on marriage was similarly unambiguous, and it was a position he held for a very long time. He famously paraphrased Groucho Marx when asked about it, saying that marriage was an institution, and he didn't want to live in an institution. He repeated versions of that line for decades. His relationship with Shannon Tweed, which began in 1983, lasted 28 years before they finally married in 2011, And even then, the catalyst was partly Shannon walking off a live television interview in frustration after Gene made a dismissive comment about the topic on air. The wedding happened a few months later. So the honest answer to why Gene never married Cher is layered. Part of it is simply that Gene Simmons, during the years he and Cher were together, was not a man who wanted to get married to anyone. His lifestyle, his values at the time, and his self-admitted complete self-absorption made the kind of commitment marriage requires something he wasn't prepared for. Cher herself understood this. She has spoken about Gene with warmth and without bitterness in the years since, describing him as charming and intelligent and someone she still thinks fondly of. But the other part of the answer is what the Christmas errand revealed. The relationship ended not because Gene made a conscious decision that he didn't want to marry Cher, but because he made a series of decisions that made marriage, or any continuation of the relationship, impossible. He has reflected on this in various interviews over the years with a degree of honesty that is unusual for someone of his public profile. He has described what he did as self-absorbed and disrespectful. He has acknowledged that he had a unique opportunity with someone genuinely remarkable and used it badly. When asked after his eventual marriage to Shannon Tweed what he had been afraid of all those years, he looked at his wedding ring and said he genuinely didn't know. Shannon Tweed, and what finally changed him. Gene Simmons met Shannon Tweed in 1983 at the Playboy Mansion. She was a Canadian actress and had been the Playboy Playmate of the Year in 1982. By this point, Gene had already been through his relationship with Cher, then Diana Ross, and a long roster of other women that he has, with characteristic lack of modesty, put it somewhere around 5,000. He was not, by any external measure, a man who appeared to be moving towards settling down. What happened with Shannon was different, and Gene has talked about why at some length. The relationship started like many of his others, but it didn't end like them. Shannon stayed. She stayed through behavior that, by Gene's own admission in a 2018 interview, would have caused most people to walk. He described himself during those first 29 years of their relationship as a jackass, self-absorbed, carousing, doing anything he pleased with no real consideration for anyone else. Shannon, he said, forgave his trespasses over and over in a way he found genuinely astonishing, and which he attributed to a capacity for seeing the bigger picture that he felt most men simply don't have.